Picture this. It's dawn in 16th century Constantinople, and you're witnessing something that would make modern royalty seem absolutely ordinary by comparison. The most powerful man on earth, ruler of 3 continents, commander of armies that struck fear into European hearts, is about to begin his day. But what you're about to see isn't the morning routine of a typical emperor. This is a man whose every breath, every step, every gesture has been choreographed by centuries of traditions so bizarre and intricate that they transform basic human activities into elaborate theatrical performances. The Ottoman Sultan, master of an empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of North Africa, lived according to rules so strange and specific that they would baffle anyone trying to understand how absolute power actually functioned in the medieval world. These weren't just customs or preferences. These were ironclad protocols that governed every moment of imperial existence, turning the most mundane daily activities into complex ceremonies that required teams of specialists to execute properly. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of power and protocol, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that subscribe button and letting me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we can explore these ancient mysteries together from different corners of the world, connected by our shared curiosity about how people lived in times so different from our own. What you're about to discover will completely change how you think about power, luxury, and the price of absolute authority. Because every single ritual we're going to explore reveals a deeper truth about the Ottoman system. These weren't just strange habits of eccentric rulers. They were carefully designed mechanisms of control that shaped one of history's most successful empires for over 600 years. The first daily ritual that governed Ottoman imperial life involved something as basic as waking up, but the process was so elaborate it required an entire department of palace officials to coordinate. The Sultan couldn't simply open his eyes and start his day like any normal person. Instead, his awakening had to be orchestrated with the precision of a military operation, involving musicians, astronomers, and religious specialists who worked together to ensure the transition from sleep to consciousness occurred at the cosmically appropriate moment. Palace astronomers spent their nights calculating the exact instant when celestial conditions would be most favorable for the Sultan's awakening. This wasn't based on practical considerations like getting enough rest or having time for important meetings. Instead, complex astrological charts determined when planetary alignments would provide the most auspicious energy for imperial consciousness to emerge from the realm of dreams. The awakening process began an hour before the calculated moment, with specially trained musicians positioned outside the royal chambers. These weren't ordinary court entertainers. They were master craftsmen who had spent years learning compositions designed specifically to gradually coax the Sultan's mind from sleep without causing the spiritual disruption that sudden awakening might create. The melodies had to follow precise mathematical relationships that supposedly harmonized with the Sultan's breathing patterns and heartbeat, but here's where it gets truly bizarre. The Sultan's first conscious thought each morning wasn't allowed to be spontaneous. Court theologians had developed elaborate formulas that determined exactly what the ruler should think about upon awakening. These weren't general guidelines about starting the day with gratitude or reflection. They were specific mental exercises that had to be performed in exact sequence, covering everything from prayers for the empire's prosperity to meditations on particular verses from religious texts that related to current political situations. The psychological impact of this controlled awakening process was profound. The Sultan couldn't experience the natural human transition from unconsciousness to awareness. Instead, every morning began with a reminder that his most private mental processes were matters of state concern, subject to professional oversight and institutional control. The second ritual involved the Sultan's morning ablutions, and it reveals the religious obsessions that governed Ottoman court life. The ruler couldn't simply wash his face and hands according to normal Islamic purification requirements. Instead, His cleansing routine had to follow protocols so detailed and specific that they required written manuals to ensure proper execution. The water used for these ablutions came from 7 different sacred sources, each blessed by different religious authorities and believed to cleanse specific types of spiritual contamination. The Sultan's body was considered to accumulate various forms of spiritual pollution throughout each day of governing, and different water sources were required to address different categories of impurity. Water from Mecca cleansed contamination from political decisions. Water from Medina addressed spiritual pollution from military commands. Springs from various holy sites throughout the empire provided purification for different aspects of imperial responsibility. The washing process itself followed intricate patterns that had been developed by court scholars who believed that the order and method of cleansing different parts of the Sultan's body would affect his decision-making abilities throughout the day. His right hand had to be washed before his left, but only after specific prayers had been recited. His face required cleansing in particular geometric patterns that supposedly aligned his spiritual energy with cosmic forces that would guide his judgment. But the true madness lay in the timing requirements. Each phase of the ablution process had to be completed within precisely calculated intervals that related to astronomical phenomena. Court timekeepers used specialized instruments to ensure that every gesture occurred at the cosmically appropriate moment, treating the Sultan's personal hygiene as a form of religious ceremony that could affect the spiritual health of the entire empire. The third daily ritual governed the Sultan's breakfast, and it demonstrates how even basic nutrition became a matter of state policy in the Ottoman system. The ruler couldn't simply eat foods that he enjoyed or that satisfied his hunger. Instead, every meal had to be designed according to complex theories that balanced medical considerations, astrological influences, and political symbolism in ways that would seem completely insane to modern people. Court physicians worked with Islamic scholars and astrologers to create daily menus that supposedly optimized the Sultan's health while reinforcing his divine authority. Different foods were believed to affect different aspects of imperial performance. Certain spices enhanced military judgment. Specific fruits improved diplomatic insight. Particular combinations of ingredients supposedly strengthened the Sultan's connection to divine guidance while protecting him from supernatural threats. The ingredient sourcing process was incredibly elaborate. Every item that entered the Sultan's meal had to be traced to its origin and blessed by religious authorities who certified its spiritual purity. Grains were harvested during specific lunar phases by farmers who had undergone purification rituals. Spices were imported from regions where Islamic scholars had performed protective ceremonies. Even the salt was collected from particular locations according to astrological calculations that determined which sources would provide the most beneficial mineral content. But the preparation process revealed the true extent of Ottoman paranoia about imperial safety. Multiple teams of cooks prepared identical meals simultaneously, working in separate kitchens under constant supervision by security specialists who monitored every step for signs of tampering or sabotage. The Sultan's food became the focus of elaborate counterintelligence operations that treated breakfast as a potential battlefield where enemies might strike through poisoned ingredients or cursed preparations. The psychological burden on the Sultan was enormous. He couldn't simply wake up hungry and eat something satisfying. Instead, every meal reminded him that his most basic biological needs had become matters of state security and religious policy, subject to professional oversight by teams of specialists who analyzed every bite for its potential impact on imperial performance. These 3 rituals represent just the beginning of a daily routine so elaborate and restrictive that it transformed the most powerful man in 3 continents into a carefully managed performance artist whose every private moment had become a matter of public concern. The 4th ritual involved the Sultan's selection of daily attire, and it reveals how even personal clothing choices became elaborate state ceremonies that required the coordination of multiple government departments. The Ottoman ruler couldn't simply look in his wardrobe and choose garments that felt comfortable or appropriate for the day's activities. Instead, every piece of clothing had to be selected according to complex calculations that considered astrological conditions, political circumstances, religious requirements, and symbolic messages that different fabrics and colors would communicate to various audiences throughout the empire. Court astrologers maintained detailed charts that correlated different textile materials with planetary influences and seasonal energies. Silk was considered most appropriate during certain lunar phases, when its properties supposedly enhanced the Sultan's diplomatic abilities. Cotton was preferred during periods when military decisions required clear thinking and decisive action. Wool was selected for ceremonies involving religious observances because its natural fibers were believed to facilitate spiritual connection and divine inspiration. The color selection process was even more intricate. Different hues carried specific political meanings that could affect how the Sultan's authority was perceived by various groups within the empire. Red fabrics communicated strength and military prowess to foreign ambassadors. Blue garments signaled religious devotion to Islamic scholars and court theologians. Gold threading indicated divine favor and celestial approval to common subjects who glimpsed the Sultan during public appearances. But here's where the system became truly psychologically oppressive. The Sultan had no input into these clothing decisions. Teams of specialists made these choices based on their professional analysis of current conditions and imperial requirements. The ruler's personal preferences about comfort, style, or aesthetic appeal were completely irrelevant to the selection process. His body became a canvas for displaying state messages, but he had no artistic control over how that canvas was decorated. The dressing process itself required elaborate choreography that involved multiple attendants working according to precise protocols that determined which garment was put on first, how each piece should be adjusted, and what prayers should be recited during different phases of the clothing ritual. The Sultan couldn't dress himself or even express preferences about how his clothes should fit. Every aspect of his appearance became a collaborative production that prioritized institutional requirements over personal comfort or individual choice. The fifth ritual governed the Sultan's morning correspondence, and it demonstrates how administrative responsibilities invaded even the most private moments of imperial life. The ruler couldn't ease into his day with casual conversation or quiet reflection. Instead, he had to immediately begin processing urgent communications from across the empire while still completing his personal morning routines. Court secretaries organized these communications according to complex priority systems that considered military threats, diplomatic emergencies, religious controversies, and administrative crises that required immediate imperial attention. The Sultan's bedroom became an extension of the imperial office, where matters of state intruded on his most intimate moments, and personal needs became secondary to governmental demands. The correspondence itself covered an incredible range of issues that revealed the scope of Ottoman administrative complexity. Military commanders sent reports about border skirmishes and troop movements that required strategic decisions. Provincial governors requested guidance about local disputes and tax collection problems that needed imperial resolution. Religious authorities sought rulings about theological controversies and legal interpretations that affected Islamic law throughout the empire. But the psychological burden went beyond simply processing large amounts of information. The Sultan had to make these crucial decisions while still completing his personal morning rituals, creating a constant tension between private needs and public responsibilities. He couldn't take time to fully wake up, eat a leisurely breakfast, or prepare mentally for the challenges ahead. Instead, he had to immediately assume the full weight of imperial responsibility while still managing his personal care and religious obligations. The sixth ritual involved the Sultan's morning prayers, and it reveals how even private spiritual devotion became a matter of public performance and state oversight. The Ottoman ruler couldn't simply communicate with God according to his personal spiritual needs or individual religious understanding. Instead, his prayers had to follow elaborate scripts that had been composed by court theologians who designed specific supplications for imperial use. These weren't standard Islamic prayers that any devout Muslim might recite. They were specially crafted compositions that addressed the unique spiritual challenges of absolute rule and the particular religious responsibilities that came with governing a vast Islamic empire. The prayers included requests for divine guidance in making military decisions, protection against supernatural threats that might target the imperial family, and forgiveness for the moral compromises that political leadership inevitably required. The prayer performance had to occur in the presence of religious officials who monitored the Sultan's spiritual condition and reported on his devotional practices to broader court authorities. These observers weren't there to provide spiritual guidance or religious support. They were conducting surveillance that treated the Sultan's relationship with God as another aspect of state policy subject to professional oversight and institutional control. The psychological impact was devastating. The Sultan couldn't experience genuine moments of private spiritual connection or personal religious reflection. Instead, his most intimate communications with the divine became theatrical performances where authenticity was less important than demonstrating proper form and orthodox compliance. His faith itself became a matter of state security that required constant monitoring and professional management. The seventh ritual concerned the Sultan's physical exercise, and it demonstrates how even basic health maintenance became subject to elaborate theoretical frameworks that prioritize symbolic considerations over practical fitness needs. The Ottoman ruler couldn't simply engage in physical activities that he enjoyed or that provided natural exercise and stress relief. Instead, his fitness regimen had to be designed by court physicians who balanced medical theories with astrological calculations and political symbolism in ways that transformed simple physical movement into complex state ceremonies. Different exercises were prescribed for different times of day based on planetary positions that supposedly influenced the Sultan's energy levels and decision-making capabilities. Morning activities focused on movements that enhanced mental clarity and spiritual connection. Afternoon exercises emphasized strength-building routines that reinforced the Sultan's physical authority and military leadership. Evening activities involved stretching and meditation practices designed to prepare his body for the elaborate sleep rituals that would follow. The exercise equipment itself had to be blessed by religious authorities and crafted according to specifications that incorporated protective symbols and sacred geometric patterns. Weights were forged from metals that had been purified through ceremonial processes. Exercise mats were woven from fibers that had been harvested during auspicious lunar phases. Even the water used for post-exercise cleansing had to come from sacred sources that provided both physical refreshment and spiritual purification. But the true psychological burden lay in the constant supervision that accompanied these fitness routines. Court physicians monitored every movement for signs of fatigue or strain that might indicate health problems requiring medical intervention. Religious observers watched for any deviation from prescribed forms that might suggest spiritual contamination or divine disfavor. Security specialists remained alert for any moment of vulnerability that enemies might exploit for assassination attempts. The Sultan couldn't simply enjoy the natural pleasure of physical movement or the stress relief that exercise provides. Instead, every moment of physical activity became another form of imperial performance, where his body's capabilities were analyzed for their political implications, and his personal fitness became a matter of state concern. The eighth and final ritual involved the Sultan's transition into his official daily schedule, and it reveals how the boundary between private life and public responsibility had been completely erased in the Ottoman system. The ruler couldn't simply finish his morning routine and begin his governmental duties according to natural rhythms or personal preferences. Instead, the transition required elaborate ceremonies that formally transformed him from a private individual into the public embodiment of imperial authority. Court officials conducted final inspections of his appearance, spiritual condition, and mental readiness before certifying that he was prepared to assume his role as the divine representative of Islamic law and Ottoman power. The certification process involved multiple specialists who examined different aspects of the Sultan's imperial readiness. Religious authorities verified that his spiritual purification had been completed correctly and that his prayers demonstrated appropriate devotion and orthodox understanding. Medical experts confirmed that his physical condition was suitable for the demands of governance and that his exercise routine had prepared him for the day's challenges. Security specialists ensured that all safety protocols had been followed and that no threats had been detected during his morning activities. But the final element of this transition ceremony revealed the ultimate psychological trap of absolute power. Before the Sultan could begin his official duties, he had to formally acknowledge that his personal needs and individual desires were now subordinated to the requirements of imperial service. This wasn't a casual recognition of professional responsibility. It was a ceremonial surrender of personal autonomy that had to be performed daily as a reminder of the price that absolute authority demanded. As you stand now in those same palace corridors where we began, watching the shadows lengthen as another day of imperial ritual concludes, you understand something profound about the nature of power itself. The Ottoman Sultan, who commanded the loyalty of millions and shaped the destiny of 3 continents, had achieved absolute authority over everyone except himself. These bizarre daily rituals weren't just strange customs or historical curiosities. They were the visible manifestation of a system that understood power as a form of performance, where legitimacy required constant demonstration and authority demanded eternal vigilance. The Sultan's most private moments had become public ceremonies, his personal needs transformed into matters of state policy, and his individual humanity sacrificed to the requirements of imperial symbolism. The man who could execute enemies with a gesture couldn't choose his own breakfast. The ruler who commanded vast armies couldn't dress himself. The emperor who shaped international diplomacy couldn't wake up naturally, or pray privately, or exercise freely. He had gained the power to control the lives of millions, but had lost control over the most basic aspects of his own existence. These strange daily rituals of the Ottoman Sultans remind us that throughout history, absolute power has always come with invisible chains that bind the powerful as surely as they control the powerless. The golden cage of imperial authority transformed every private moment into public performance and every personal need into governmental responsibility, creating a system where the price of ultimate power was the surrender of basic human freedom. The Sultan's elaborate morning routine reveals a truth that echoes through the centuries. Sometimes the greatest prison is the one built from our own success, and the heaviest chains are those forged from pure gold.